So I'm on the couch with John Myers, who's just had this very nice book published by RRB. And these are pictures taken from the 70s. How did it take so long to get these pictures out, John?
The work was, as it were, rediscovered by the Icon Gallery, and the full range of the work from the 70s and 80s was finally exhibited there, and then this has led to this publication.
And your style is very clean, direct, very beautiful. What sort of photographers were you looking at to be sort of influenced to have this kind of vision, which is almost ahead of its time, really? The pictures you're taking in the 70s feel much more contemporary than the 70s pictures that we often see associated with British photography.
Well, I was very much against the kind of dominant aesthetic at the time of the picturesque. My background is in fine art. I was very much interested in Dada and Surrealism and Duchamp, the work of Ed Ruscha. And when I started taking photographs initially in 1972, the people that really resonated with me were T.H. O'Sullivan, the American pioneer photographer, and William Jackson, the two of them that photographed the discovery of the Midwest in the 1860s and 70s. Eugene Auger, Walker Evans, August Sander. And then I started taking photographs in 72 into 73, and then of course there was the big exhibition of Arbus's work that occurred in this country around that time. And essentially, Arbus is a continuation, in my view. I mean, she learnt an enormous amount from Sander. And effectively what she does is she kind of replaces composition with photographs that are effectively about interpersonal space. I mean, I think it's a mistake to review Arbus entirely as being about photographs of freaks. When you actually look at the classic Aperture publication that dated from around 74, there are only a handful that are actually of freaks, so-called. There's the Jewish giant, etc., etc. But if you think of the photograph of the babies, or the woman on 6th Avenue with the big earrings, I mean, they're just ordinary people. What distinguishes them is the fact that you can't actually get away from them. They're very much about where you are in respect to the subject and the space that they occupy. And in a kind of a way, that notion of the spatial relationship between the photographer and the subject, you find it in Auger, you find it in Sullivan, you find it in Jackson. You also find it in Lewis Hine. You also find it in Belloc. And that group of photographers, and also the often overlooked kind of anonymous photographer, was an important kind of influence and interest. You think of estate agent photographs, where different kinds of aesthetics, different kind of impetuses are actually replacing either the narrative or the notion of actually trying to make the world look beautiful. So that, in a kind of nutshell, is the kind of group of photographers.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're a British photographer, and yet you don't mention any British photographers in your set of influences. They're all people that have come from abroad.
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
Benjamin Stone.
Well, no, I did actually in 72 or 73. I mean, prior to Pete James being involved with the library, I actually went over to the Birmingham Public Library and looked at the Benjamin Stone albums. That very much in response to the book by Jay. But what they're fine, but they're not. the great thing about Sander and the most recent exhibition that was held in Liverpool in 2017 or 16 was very evident. The photographs were ranged as a line around the gallery, and the hands of the subject or subjects were almost at my eye level. And as you walked round, the hands do the talking. It's almost as if you're in a room with someone who is actually doing sign language. And you never get that with sort of Benjamin Stone. There's none of that kind of understanding of.
Yeah, I understand. Tell me a bit about how you met the people you did the portraits of in the West Midlands. Were they people you knew, or did you introduce yourself? How did it work?
Most of them were people I knew, or they were people that I saw around. I never went out looking to take a photograph. I would meet someone and I would make an arrangement to go around and take a photograph. And I never actually insisted on, they should wear a particular item of clothing or whatever. So yeah, really, it's not a scientific cross-section of the population. It's people that I knew, colleagues, children of colleagues, neighbours, friends, students, but they're also in amongst people that I came across. I mean, the butcher's boy, for example, or the boy at the cactus farm. These were people that I came across and photographed.
Was it a problem to get people not to smile?
Well, you've got to remember that the photographs were taken with a 5.4 Gandolfi plate camera, and I never used flash. The photographs were taken very often indoors, so exposures were long to start with. I was using natural lighting, and the amount of time that it takes to actually set up the tripod and the camera on the tripod, and then, as you know, you've got to, under the cloth, you focus it, then you set the lens, then you put the dark slide in, and then you wait. And I used to say, the exposure will be about half a second. You will hear a click and a purr, and I don't want you to blink if you can. So getting to that point, the person would have either been stood or sat for 10 minutes, maybe even longer. And I took photographs in silence, and I took them alone. There were no distractions. And I never used to say very much. I must have said something, of course. But really, I was concentrating on what I was doing with the camera on the tripod. And they, I suppose, after 5 minutes or even longer, suddenly realised that, well, I wasn't going to tell them what to do with their hands or how to look. I wasn't effectively doing what David Bailey does, where you see these fashion shoots and people are manipulated like puppets or marionettes. I wasn't doing that at all. And what you begin to realise is that most of our lives, we very rarely sit still ever. And suddenly when you're faced in that kind of relationship, one-to-one, people change. And the initial expectation that they may have that they've actually got to perform, they've got to smile or grimace, actually melts away, and increasingly they settle into their own skins. They become something different. And it's very odd, because there were some people that were wholly resistant to that process. But in the main, maybe Maybe it was my technique. Quite a lot of people actually partook.
Well, I've learned a lesson there because because I'm so much faster. I have this issue with people smiling, and my problem is I'm not taking enough time.
Well, but that is the beauty of the Gandolfi camera. That I would go out, I would make the arrangement. I'd go around the house. The difficult thing was, you suddenly get into their living room, and there is actually the bay window, or there's one light source, and you've got to. That's where I want to take the photograph. So it's very tight. You've got your back against the back wall. And it's a slow process.
Yeah.
And so I might actually only take 2 shots. One would be a test negative.
Mm-hmm.
So you get it right first time.
Mm-hmm.
And the photographs were never edited after. They're edited in camera. And that's why there are clip marks visible on some of the shots. Yeah. Because the space that the people are in, the fluid that surrounds them, is just as important as the figure themselves.
Yeah, I get it. So finally, I just want to ask you about one of my other favourite series from that era, the television sets.
Yeah.
We look at them now and we think, God, these are amazing because they're antiquated, but at the time they must have been very contemporary. Why did you understand and have the foresight to recognise that the television would be such an iconic image in just then and in years to come?
Well, I didn't have that foresight. And one has got to be honest about it. I mean, what you've got to bear in mind is that in 1972, 73, 74, the television date from 1973. The giraffe date's from 1973 as well. The substations date from 1974. The boring photographs date from 73 to 75.
You're on fire.
I was on fire. There was no project. There was no plan. There was no planned outcomes in the way that very many people work nowadays. They plan for a book or an exhibition. I was taking photographs for myself. And the televisions, I think the problem, let me blow my nose, the problem when you sit down and talk about the past is that because the way that we construct sentences and reason and logic and history, people expect there to be reasons. And the fact is that I didn't have a Roy Stryker in the background telling me what to photograph.
Mm-hmm.
It was very much a response to the world that I lived in.
Yeah.
I didn't have Yosemite outside my front door. I didn't have Edward Weston's California beaches outside the front door. I lived and live in a world that is made up of tarmac, semi-detached housing, tower blocks, maisonettes, cars, substations, and televisions. And what's interesting about the televisions is not necessarily my foresight, is that when they're exhibited, people have always, because if I give a talk about them, when I do a talk around the exhibition, we get to the portraits and there is silence. And usually someone says, well, why did you photograph televisions? And then I say, well, we all now live in a world where we actually spend our time in front of screens. People go to work on the train and they've got screens in front of them. They get to the office and they spent the day in front of the screen. And then they go back on the train in front of a screen on a phone or a laptop. And then they get back home, they have their tea, probably in front of the television, watch the football or the news. And oddly enough, the televisions themselves in the photographs actually aren't there. People talk about, well, we had an action man like that, or they talk about the plants that are on top of the televisions, but the televisions themselves have actually become invisible. And the way I can now see them is I kind of liken them to that book by Wyndham about I think it's called The Kraken Awakes, where the Earth is kind of invaded by aliens, and these alien televisions are actually in the corner of the room, and they're sat there, and in a kind of a way they've taken over.
Mm-hmm.
But the television set is actually, I think, I may be proved incorrect, but I think it's the first typology of the new era.
Yeah.
And
I get it.
there's only one set. There's only one set of vintage photographs. Unfortunately. I wish there were more.
Well, thank you very much, John. That's a great insight.